podcast is part of the Sports Social Podcast Network.
Ladies and gentlemen, as part of our summer series of interviews with various people from the football world, I'm extremely pleased to be joined by Michael Cox, well known throughout the internet as Zonal Marking. But now, Michael, we have to use your real name because you're not just an internet person anymore. You're now like a proper grown-up author.
Yeah, existing in the real world and not just on Twitter. Yeah, it's nice to have that upgrade. Yeah.
So tell us a bit about the book, The Mixer, which is just come out pretty recently.
Yeah, it's basically a history of the Premier League. Obviously, it's the 25th anniversary this summer. It seemed like a good occasion for someone to write a book about the Premier League. There'd never really been a particularly comprehensive account written before. Obviously, it focuses a little bit on tactics, but it's it's anecdotal. There's stories. There's fun stuff. It's not too technical. There's no diagrams, and it's a story rather than a kind of technical handbook. So I'm confident that it's quite a good read.
Fantastic. You're of course very well known for your tactical stuff, and I'm really interested in whether. So when you went and kind of looked back to do the book, even if the bent was a bit more generalist and not quite so specifically tactical, did you discover anything about the tactical evolution of the Premier League that you weren't expecting?
Yeah, a few things really. The book starts with a look at the change to the back pass rule, and I'd kind of always been aware that was quite a important thing in the evolution of football, but it hadn't really occurred to me that the back pass came in just before the start of the Premier League. And so, when everyone says football didn't start in 1992, of course it didn't, but modern football in a sense did start in 1992, and nothing to do with the formation of the Premier League. There was this rule that, took effect throughout the world and really changed the way that teams play, particularly in terms of, having to build up from the back rather than just hitting long balls from the goalkeeper, because the goalkeeper couldn't just pick up the ball all the time. So yeah, there were a few interesting things going back to the 90s. Just looking at how primitive things were back then was quite interesting. It's only 20 years ago since the mid 90s, and this was a time when basically teams often didn't really have proper training grounds. They were kind of just using university training grounds or sometimes renting it from the local council kind of thing. And their preparation for matches really was quite shambolic, really. They didn't look at the opposition in any kind of depth. They kind of just had one way of playing and played that way each week. So tactics then were very different to tactics now. And that, charting that evolution was I guess, the main job, really.
So what are the key inflection points? What are the key moments that shaped it from what it was then to what it is now?
That's a good question. In the early 90s, I think the first real tactician, as appropriate for this conversation, the first real tactician was Sir Alex Ferguson, or he wasn't Sir then, but Alex Ferguson. It's quite interesting. I went through his kind of diaries that he published in the 90s, and just his kind of the extent to which he's in awe of the European greats, Ajax, Milan, Barcelona, Juventus, and is travelling abroad each week to go and watch these teams play. And he's realising before anyone else in the Premier League that, European teams are ahead of the English teams tactically. And the fact that United were in the European Cup pretty much every season at a time when obviously England only had one entrant into the European Cup at that point just means that he's directly learning lessons of Barcelona and Milan and the real greats. And I think, that forced him to kind of change how United played and to be more reactive. And I think one thing that he did very much in response to that was he was very keen to promote what I'd call players who could do a job. So, someone like Brian McClair, he goes on about in the early days in terms of, if he told him to play central midfield or right midfield or centre forward, or if he told him to shut down a certain player, he could do that. And this was a time when British players weren't really geared towards that kind of way of playing. They were more about going out and expressing themselves and getting involved in the battle. And I think Ferguson was throughout the 90s, in a tactical sense, was always really a step ahead of the other managers like Keegan and Dalglish, who pretty much told their players to play 4-4-2 and played the same way every week.
It's really interesting to hear you say that, because I think because Ferguson had so many strengths as a manager, people maybe don't think of him as a tactician, but when he turned to his mind to it, he really could use tactics to his advantage, couldn't he?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it was a really key part of United's evolution throughout, say from 93, their first time in the European Cup, to obviously winning it in 99. Just the kind of level of sophistication of United just improved massively. And I think part of that was, United brought in different kind of player. I mean, if you look at the 93-94 title winners, who I think really were probably the best in that era in terms of playing 4-4-2 and getting the ball forward quickly and breaking down the flanks. Between that and 99, obviously they brought in Beckham on the right and Scholes in midfield, who were kind of more cultured players, better in possession, and they could keep the ball for longer periods. But also, Ferguson was just experimenting tactically, and going through that 99 run is really interesting because obviously in the final was a kind of a classic Manchester United win where they kind of won it in almost illogical circumstances. But the way that they got past Juventus and the way that they got past Inter was just really interesting in a tactical sense. Ferguson with two different game plans, home and away, making key decisions about personnel. I think he left Paul Scholes out both games in order to play Nicky Butt, who was more defensive. Particularly doing a job on Zidane. I think against Baggio as well. In the Inter game. And just looking at, how much he admired those great European teams makes you realise that United really were just a cut above in the Premier League at that point. And obviously Wenger came in 96 and improved a lot of things in a kind of physiological sense, and I think was certainly at first was better than Ferguson at recruiting players from abroad. But in the tactical sense, Wenger was never really a great tactician, and really it was Ferguson who was leading the way during that period.
And so we're still really talking about 4-4-2, right? Even by 99, there are nuances to it, but it's essentially that's essentially what he's playing. When does it start to be the case that the other formations are considered as normal as 4-4-2?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I guess it's the start of the 21st century, really. I mean, obviously in the 90s, United had kind of played a more cultured way. I think Eric Cantona is probably the most revolutionary player in the Premier League in terms of coming in and playing between the lines. And he turned that into pretty much a 4-4-1-1. But I think the interesting thing is that Ferguson, in the 90s, it tended to be that tactical shifts occurred from players coming in and changing their style of play. So when Cantona came in, he changed United in terms of going to 4-4-1-1. But when it got to the 21st century, Ferguson almost looked at things the other way. So he looked at the formation first and then the players. And then obviously you had that, that summer of bringing in both Veron, because he was kind of a third top-class central midfielder, and bringing in Ruud van Nistelrooy, who was a player who could play up front. And Ferguson didn't really think that, Andy Cole could play up front alone, and Cole and York kind of faded very quickly because, they weren't built for that system. So I guess it was the start of the 21st century where Ferguson started moving towards a one-striker system, albeit with mixed success. I mean, United often moved back to 4-4-2 during Van Nistelrooy's first season. I think Solskjaer was coming into the side and doing very well. And I'd say that the period with Van Nistelrooy wasn't particularly successful at United because essentially they were just too dependent on him, and everything was trying to get the ball to Van Nistelrooy in goal-scoring positions. And obviously there was a kind of a second evolution much later during the Ronaldo era, when they often played one up front, but it was more about collective interplay and basically just goals coming from a wider variety of sources rather than everything based around Van Nistelrooy. But of the top managers, it really was Ferguson who was the first to move towards a one-striker system.
So we've got Ferguson adapting the 4-4-2 to be a match for the continental game. Then we've got him adapting again to a one-striker system, which now it's kind of revolutionary, and you don't play one striker on their own up front, isn't it, at the moment?
Yeah, sure.
That's a kind of it's a really trailblazing approach, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing about Ferguson is, I mean, there's certain other revolutionaries that have come to the game and have really obviously changed things. So Wenger in 96 with the physiological side. I think the arrival of Mourinho and Benitez at the same time in 2004 maybe England or made English football a lot more reactive, a lot more defensive. And I think even now you can say Conte coming over and playing 3-4-3 kind of completely dominated the league last year. And so Ferguson, because he wasn't coming from abroad, was never such a stark revolutionary. But in kind of slightly more subtle ways, I think he was always just remaining one step ahead. And again, taking his cue from Barcelona and Milan rather than necessarily what was going on elsewhere in English football. So, yeah, I mean, just the extent that Ferguson managed to evolve again and again and again, season after season, in probably the period of English football that saw more sweeping changes than ever before, is just remarkable. And, there's various aspects to that. I think the fact he always brought in different assistant managers, sometimes by choice, sometimes because he was forced to. That always meant that, United kept evolving. But, the way he built, maybe 4 different sides, really, when you think about, it stems from 92 to 2013, pretty much 20 years. They just had to keep evolving. And I don't know, you almost kind of took it for granted at the time that United was so successful. But then in the last few years when, no one's actually retained the league since United did in 2009, it just goes to show how incredible it was that United were just so successful for such a long period of time under one manager.
Yeah, absolutely. Were there standout tactical performances from Ferguson along the way? Are there games that you kind of looked at and thought, wow, that's really, he's doing something different here than he would normally do across the course of the season?
Yeah, I mean, there's a very early one, actually, in the first Premier League season, so 92-93, and it's a game I must admit I wasn't massively aware of, but it's United going away to Norwich in the April, I think, when it's pretty much Norwich, Villa, and Manchester United for the title, and Norwich had been flying at this point. They'd I think by Christmas they were like 8 points clear, and they were playing this really impressive, kind of quite progressive passing football, really, which wasn't that common in the Premier League at the time, and kind of the neutrals' favourite because obviously they're the outsiders compared to Villa and United, who've been there or thereabouts in recent seasons. And that was quite an interesting game because Ferguson was out without Mark Hughes, who was the main centre forward at the time. And everyone thought that, in response to being without Hughes, he played Brian McClare up front and bring Brian Robson into midfield and just basically be a bit more solid. But instead he played Ryan Giggs up front, he played McClare in midfield, and essentially United played with 3 wingers, so they had Giggs and they had Sharp and they had Kanchelskis. And just the first 20 minutes of that match is kind of the most terrifying display of counter-attacking football that you'll ever see. And it's just so quick. The way that United go from end to end within 10 seconds for their 3 goals, Cantona's pulling the strings, Giggs and Kanchelskis in particular are fantastic, and Paul Ince as well in midfield is just everywhere. And it was just this incredible clash between a possession side and a really quick counter-attacking side. And I think that pretty much set the tone for how United would play in the upcoming seasons. I think Cantona was quoted saying it was the perfect performance, it was the perfect game. And just that kind of model of having a really quick striker, even though Giggs wasn't a striker, but having a really quick player up front, someone in the hole in Cantona and 2 really speedy wingers, set the tone for how United would play. But I think probably set the tone for how lots of other teams in the Premier League would play. I think you can look at the Arsenal team under Wenger and see, 2 really quick wingers, Bergkamp in the Cantona mould, always a really quick striker, whether it was, Ian Wright or Anelka or Henry. And, you wonder what might have happened had things gone the other way. If Norwich had won that game and had gone on to win the title with this really kind of elegant, patient, possession-based team, then maybe throughout the 90s, a lot more teams would have played that way. But in the end, it took probably about 15 years for possession football to really come into the fore. And it was all about really, pace and counter-attack and being very direct, which, I think kind of stems back to that United performance.
That is absolutely fascinating, isn't it? That's a heck of a sliding doors moment. So the over the kind of the next decade, it's the same tactical template, and then the beginning of the 2000s. You mentioned that the kind of slightly barren days under Van Nistelrooy. There was a point when United fans were chanting 4-4-2 from the stadium quite regularly, but that never really happened again, did it?
No, probably not in that sense. I mean, there was a period where I guess it was more 4-4-1-1 with Rooney and Hernandez, and then I guess a similar kind of thing with him and Berbatov sometimes, and later with Van Persie. But I think Rooney was always, he was a more withdrawn striker than you would say for a 4-4-2. I mean, I guess there's a slight argument that Dwight York dropped off into deeper positions in '99. But I think Ferguson was quite clear. He always wanted, as he put it, 2 points of attack, so someone between the lines and someone kind of on the shoulder. And it was pretty rare for United to play a classic 4-4-2 in later days. I think that was very crucial to their progress in Europe during the late 2010s, certainly. The late 2000s, certainly.
It's interesting that you sort of talk about 4-4-1-1 because when the crowd did start chanting 4-4-2, it really annoyed Ferguson, and he said we've never played 4-4-2. I mean, it was slightly disingenuous, but he said we always played with one deeper and one further forward. But Dwight Yorke scored an awful lot of goals from the 6-yard box in 1999.
I agree, and just his relationship with Andy Cole just felt like, they were roughly playing the same role. Cole was more of a poacher, I suppose, and Yorke was better in deeper positions. But it wasn't like a Cantona and Cole, where Cantona was clearly the deeper player. It wasn't like a Bergkamp and Henry, where Bergkamp was clearly the playmaker. I think Yorke was probably a second striker rather than a number 10. So I tend to agree with you there. I always think of that 99 team as pretty much a 4-4-2 with just really good partnerships all over the pitch, and obviously Yorke and Cole was one of them.
Then, so to flash forward to the next time that United won the European Cup, you briefly touched on the kind of Ronaldo era. I mean, would you say that that's like essentially Fergie's 4-3-3 period?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think United they were quite unpredictable at that point. I think that's probably the point where particularly Ferguson, but other managers as well, kind of did give their attackers lots of freedom to kind of rotate. And so you've got this system where essentially Ronaldo can go where he wants. If he senses that he's going to be good up against the left back or the right side of the centre back, he kind of goes there, and the other players, whether it's Giggs or Rooney or Park or Nani, kind of just have to fill in wherever possible. Or Tevez as well, of course, was very good at that. It's very flexible and very fluid. But I think 4-3-3 was kind of the dominant shape for United at that time, but they always retained an ability to go 4-4-2 as well, or 4-4-1-1. The Champions League final in 2008, obviously Ronaldo was playing wide left up against Essien because of Essien's lack of height, and that proved perfect for the opening goal. But in that game, it was pretty much 4-4-2 because Hargreaves started on the right flank, which is obviously a little bit unusual for him, and you had Rooney and Ronaldo up front, and then he shifted at half-time. I think when Chelsea had kind of got back into the game just before half-time with that Lampard goal, and Hargreaves came into his more natural position in the centre. I think it was Rooney going right and Tevez staying up front. Might have been the other way around. But they just had the flexibility and the dynamism to kind of play both systems simultaneously. And I think that was probably the case for the next few seasons, really. I mean, even when Ronaldo left, there was that period, 2009-10, when I thought United were actually a really good team and pretty unlucky not to win the league ahead of Chelsea that year. And obviously Valencia came in, Nani stepped up, and there was still that ability to play either system, whether it's Berbatov and Rooney up front, or increasingly in that season with Rooney as the number 9. And, he scored a load of headed goals that season and kind of became a proper striker. So, I think it probably wasn't the case so much later on when Van Persie came into the team. That was more of a kind of 4-4-1-1. But that period kind of either side of, I guess between when United won it in 2008 and when they got to the final in 2011, there was just great flexibility in that team.
You mentioned the Van Persie period. This is it's a fascinating season. Obviously, it's one that United fans have a huge amount of affection for, but it's basically 2 seasons in the same season because up until Christmas, it's just conceding 1 million goals every game and scoring 1,000,001. And it's like, what's happened? He's flashed back to, he knows it's his last season, so he wants to relive 1998 or whatever. And then in the second half of the season, when it becomes clear they're going to win the league, he just shuts everything down and they win every game 1-0, basically.
Yeah, it was a very strange season. Just a weird one. I mean, I don't really know what was happening with United in terms of the central midfield zone at that point was always a bit of a mess. And to be honest, I didn't think that was a great United team by any stretch of the imagination. I think probably one of the weaker ones that's won the Premier League. But obviously they had Van Persie, who was absolutely flying up front, and his relationship with Rooney was great, which I guess was epitomised by that volley Van Persie scored in the title clinching goal against Aston Villa. But I think it felt like United kind of eased off by that point. I mean, I think that that side would struggle, I think, against even the 2011 title winners, and certainly against the 2008, 2009 side. They just didn't really have the control in central midfield. And I think that's what was so impressive about, particularly the 2008 team. They had Scholes and they had Carrick and they had Hargreaves. And I think that's a level of control in central midfield, particularly when they played three in there, that no United team before or since has really offered.
It was really weird watching Ferguson not do anything about the midfield year after year after year. I could never understand why it was happening. It felt like he'd developed a blind spot. He could still win the league anyway, but I don't know. It was very strange.
Yeah, well, there was that famous game. I think it was just after Christmas one year, maybe 2010, when it was it like Park and
Rafael da Silva?
Yeah, in central midfield, which is just. I mean, I know they had a couple of players out, and I think that was the game when Rooney was kind of being suspended because he'd been caught out drinking or something like that. But it was just how have United gone, to that level, considering the central midfield options they had a few years earlier. But yeah, it's weird. I mean, Ferguson had been so keen to make sure United dominated the midfield during the preceding years. So I can't really work out what happened with just. Like you say, not really signing anyone in that position, and I guess also kind of promoting the wrong people in overlooking Pogba and probably too much faith in Cleverley and a couple of other players.
Yeah, that was the Pogba game. That was the game when he looked at it and went, right, I'm off. I've had enough of this. If you're not going to play me ahead of Park and Rafael. Maybe he was just trying to. Ferguson was like, had been a trailblazer for so long. He was trying to trailblaze a new world where midfield was no longer important.
Yeah, quite possibly. I mean, I remember it being a very entertaining game. Was it a 4-3 defeat to Steve Keane's Blackburn? I think it was, wasn't it? I mean, I remember it being a bonkers game, but probably not a title-winning recipe.
No, the thing I remember about it is just that United lost, and also Ferguson gave up on Rafael in midfield at half-time. I can't remember who he brought on in his stead, but it made slightly more sense.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah, I can't have Rafael down as a central midfielder. Much as I do like him, I was kind of sad it didn't work out for him in the end, because I really like Rafael. But anyway.
Question of the post Sir Alex Ferguson Manchester United. Because it was Louis van Gaal who turned his back on all that was good and pure and true and sold Rafael. Moyes' kind of attempt to, I don't know, almost try and force 4-4-2 back into vogue at United did not go well at all. It seemed like there was very little tactical sophistication there. Was he a manager who had been more tactically astute at Everton previously, so he was just struggling to adapt to the new pressures at United, or was this a more general weakness in his management?
Yeah, I think it's a difficult question. I mean, I think the important thing really is I'm not sure that tactically that was, I'm not sure Moyes' biggest problem was a tactical sense. I think he was kind of just overwhelmed by the scale of the job and the pressures of managing United. But I guess the tactics feeds into it in the sense that at Everton he'd become very good at just being very reactive and concentrating very hard on essentially, shutting down the opposition and nullifying their strengths. But Everton always had quite a big record away at the big clubs. And, Moyes was kind of good at setting out a side not to get beaten rather than setting out a side to win. And obviously when you go to Manchester United, the expectations are raised. And I think there was a very similar thing with what happened with Roy Hodgson at Liverpool, where basically it's just a step up to a really massive club who basically have to be more proactive and have to, one, they have to put on a show, two, they have to win games because that's the level they're at, and three, they're playing against teams who will come to Old Trafford in Moyes' sense, or Anfield in Hodgson's sense, and sit back, and you have to have the kind of attacking combination play to break them down. I don't think United ever had that. It was just a really weird kind of period. I mean, obviously, Moyes didn't change too much from the previous season. There were very few outgoings. I think it was only Fellaini who came in. So it was pretty much the same team. I don't think that they played in a radically different way, but it was just a kind of different mentality they played with. And I think, sadly, in terms of the kind of traditional old school leadership qualities, Moyes just didn't have it really.
Yeah, absolutely. Then you mentioned teams being difficult to break down and coming to defend. This turned out to be the amazingly effective antidote to literally anything that Louis van Gaal ever tried to do. Just all you had to do was try and stop them and you would likely be successful. from a slightly football nerd perspective, from my point of view, it was a real shame. I mean, obviously, as a United fan, I wanted it to work out, but I just wanted it to work out because I thought it would be fascinating to see if a kind of Van Gaal possession style side could make something exciting happen in the Premier League, because he'd made some brilliant teams, but the United team he created was a stodgy, horrible mess.
Yeah, it was a weird period, and I kind of agree with you. I think it was a bit of a shame. I mean, when you look at what he did with particularly that Ajax side 95, was one of the best teams of the last 20, 25 years. It was a weird one with Van Gaal. I thought he took a long time to work out precisely what he was trying to do. I mean, he was messing around with the three at the back for quite a long time when it really felt like it wasn't working. He also had, an incredible injury crisis at the back, which meant he had to chop and change, and that was problematic. There's a couple of players I don't think he massively knew what to do with, particularly Di Maria, who's just a brilliant footballer, and I think actually quite a Manchester United footballer in many ways, but that didn't quite work out. And then, I mean, by the second season, United were actually really well organised without the ball. I think I'm right in saying that they had the best defensive record, or maybe the second best defensive record that season. The spacing between the players, just the structure of the team was great, but they just didn't seem to have the attacking combination play. And I think to a certain extent that was because United didn't really have top-class individuals, and I think that the attacking section of the side is the one place where I think you definitely need really top-class players, whereas defending, you can kind of have a very good coach who kind of irons out the weaknesses and just makes the team solid. And so it kind of felt like the second season should have been the first season, if that makes sense. If the second season had been the first season, then that would have been a good kind of building block to move forward from. But it kind of been 2 years of relatively little progress, I think, which was obviously a little bit underwhelming. But it was cool that he kind of got swept under the carpet, but he went out with winning an FA Cup, which is traditionally is considered a pretty good thing. And it's amazing that, obviously the last, 4 years since Ferguson left, United is widely considered they've been below par, but they've won 2 FA Cups, they've won a League Cup. Even the Community Shield just kind of keeps things ticking over and keeps players in the right mentality. So, yeah, they're still winning trophies that other teams at the top of the league, can't manage to get their hands on.
Yeah, it was just one FA Cup and then the Europa League, but it was lovely winning the FA Cup because it's been a long time. Because at some point Ferguson decided that wasn't really important to him anymore, and made a load of compromises, didn't he, along the way? But it was lovely to Van Gaal won it. It was just a shame that the story that he was getting sacked the next day leaked literally as he was walking up the stairs to collect the trophy. It was
that was a shame, I think, and it kind of, in a wider sense, I think it kind of feeds into a bit of a problem with football coverage at the moment, or certainly I feel like the last 10 years, when it's always looking towards kind of transfers and in this respect kind of manager situation rather than what's actually happening on the pitch. And the fact that the following day's headlines were Van Gaal to be sacked when United have just won the cup, I thought it was a real shame. And just kind of for me summarises what's problematic about football coverage. I like reading about what happens on the pitch rather than kind of what's going to happen in 3 months' time. But I guess that's the way of the world.
It is. And the other thing that it is important to say at this point is I've never been as bored. I mean, I've almost literally never been as bored in any setting in my life as I was watching United for much of that season. It was absolutely dire in a way that was genuinely sort of soul-sucking and quite sad, because not just in a United sense, but just any football to kind of, it felt so, just going felt redundant because you kind of knew nothing good would happen.
Yeah, I completely agree. I just really wasn't looking forward to watching United that season, and that was quite sad, like you say, because I mean, United, under Ferguson, I think United had spells where they didn't play good football, but it was always entertaining. They could play absolutely rubbish for 70 minutes and still launch the most miraculous comeback to win 2-1 or whatever. But yeah, there was just none of that under Van Gaal, no excitement, no spark. And it's a shame that that's kind of how he'll be remembered, certainly in this country, because, his Ajax side and his Bayern Munich side were just so entertaining.
Yeah, that's the thing. Like, he's not someone that you associate with boring football, really.
Yeah, no, it's a shame.
It felt like he got older. That's what really, in a way that Ferguson never really seemed to. It felt like he got older and a little more cautious. And that brings us to a man who has been pretty influential in the history of Premier League tactics, I guess. How much difference did Mourinho make when he arrived the first time around?
Yeah, massive difference. I mean, as I say, I think, him and Benitez coming at the same time was very crucial. Obviously, Benitez won the European Cup first season. But Mourinho's, that first Chelsea season was absolutely remarkable. Looking back, they got 95 points, which is still a record. They only conceded 15 goals all season and kept 25 clean sheets, which is just, you just can't get your head around that now. But yeah, he was probably the first manager to really play, I guess, a counter-attacking 4-3-3. They had Makelele in the Makelele role, the role defined by him. And yeah, just put real big emphasis upon counter-attacking, really big emphasis upon the concept of the transition. So when the team loses the ball or when the team wins possession, they have to spring forward into a different shape immediately. And that was something that wasn't really spoken about in English football beforehand. And yeah, it just kind of outmaneuvered teams in the midfield zone, really, by putting an extra player in there. And it was noticeable, really, a little bit like with Conte last season, just how many managers changed their system almost overnight. And they didn't really do it with the kind of nuances that Mourinho did. So Chelsea had, Damien Duff and Arjen Robben, who were kind of two classic wingers. Whereas a lot of teams tried to do the same kind of thing with like classic, wide midfielders in a four. So that, teams were basically just taking off a striker and putting on, an extra centre midfielder. It made things very defensive. But obviously his overall impact, Mourinho's overall impact was staggering, really. And
what have you made of his sort of development as a manager since? Because he's definitely not the same as he was then, is he?
No, I think he's changed a lot in terms of his character as much as his kind of tactics. You go back to the early days at Chelsea and, he was always a wind-up merchant. He was always getting himself into squabbles and stuff, but he was also very charming and was just, quite likeable. It was quite weird. Chelsea didn't really have a real superstar player in the manner of, when Mourinho had Ronaldo at Real Madrid or now he's got Pogba. They were kind of quite an efficient bunch, really. But Mourinho was almost a superstar, and he was quite popular at the time, I think, in English football. He was kind of a breath of fresh air. People had enjoyed the Ferguson-Wenger rivalry, but that was kind of, 7 or 8 years in now. And then suddenly we had this, young guy, never been a player, won European Cup with a Porto team that had started as real outsiders. And it was just exciting to have him here. And I think now he kind of gives off kind of a demeanour of almost negativity and just boredom with his kind of general approach, which I think is a bit of a shame because, he won the league in 2015. With 2 years after that, he's clearly not finished at the highest level. And obviously he won a couple of trophies this season as well. So, yeah, I think he has changed a lot. I think he was, to a certain extent, damaged by what happened at Real Madrid in terms of the dressing room backlash in his third season. And the same thing, with Chelsea, again, in his third season there, in his second spell. But I think United are the kind of right club for him. I think he's quite a good fit tactically. And yeah, I think there needs to be kind of quite obvious progress in the opening periods of next month. And I think United will need to challenge for the title for you guys to remain on board with him. But I do think he's quite a good fit for United.
And what did you make of him last season, sort of in terms of what he put on the pitch? I thought he made there were a lot of interesting small decisions along the way, and I guess a player who is quite tactically complicated. You mentioned Pogba. I would imagine that for a manager, having Pogba in the side is obviously a massive asset, but it gives you a lot of decisions to make about how you use him, doesn't it?
Yeah, he's a kind of awkward player, Pogba. I'm a massive fan, and I think he received quite a lot of criticism last season from the wider media, which I think in general is the kind of thing that isn't shared by United fans, because I think the more you watch him, the more you realise he's a really good player. But he's slightly different. He's not a kind of player that plays deep in a two-man midfield because I think he likes pushing forward too much. Obviously, he can do that in certain circumstances. I think he's better kind of as a three when he's got, license to go forward, almost in that kind of old Frank Lampard mould of breaking forward from the left of centre. It seems like Mourinho did take a while to work out precisely how to use him. Maybe he's the kind of player that won't necessarily always have a particularly defined role, and it will just change depending upon the nature of the game. Personally, I think that Pogba needs a lot of freedom to go forward. He can spread play nicely in deep positions, but I think he's got the dynamism, and I think there's some goal scoring potential in there that can mean he basically can play almost behind the forward in a kind of Dele Alli mould, almost, that kind of a midfielder, but almost a second striker. I'd like to see him really as high up the pitch as possible, because I think that's where he will provide the difference. And obviously United need goals from the performance last season. They need an improvement there, and I think Pogba could be that kind of player who can step up and become a regular goal scorer.
Brilliant. Michael, thank you so much for your time. Where can the people find you?
They can find me on Twitter at Zonal Marking, or indeed, the Mixer is out now on Amazon and in your local bookshop, so do check that out.
Brill. Thanks, Michael.
My pleasure. Thank you very much, Paul.
This podcast is part of the Sports Social Podcast Network.
We interrupt this program to bring you an important Wayfair message. Wayfair's got style tips for every home. This is Styles McKenzie helping you make those rooms sing. Today's style tip: when it comes to making a statement, treat bold patterns like neutrals. Go wild, like an untamed animal print area rug under a rustic farmhouse table from Wayfair.com. Arr, fierce. This has been your Wayfair style tip to keep those interiors superior.
Wayfair, every style, every home.